Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Teaching New Deal Art, a new survey for students, teachers, and the public. My name is Mary Oken, and I am the Living New Deal, or LND, Assistant Director. If you're new to LND, we've been around for about 18 years, beginning as a research project in the Geography Department at UC Berkeley and growing into a nonprofit organization of national scope. Our mission is to document, map, teach, and advocate for New Deal art and public works, primarily through our website, www.livingnewdeal.org. This free educational resource shares the largest inventory of New Deal sites ever to be created, over 19,000 New Deal sites and counting, which is assembled through the generous support of private donors and with the help of ordinary people and researchers all across the country. Living New Deal's donors also support our public programming, such as tonight's webinar, and our Advocating for New Deal Art Initiative, or ANDA for short, which includes historic preservation advocacy that you may have seen or heard about in the last couple of months. For much of this year, we have been building a campaign to save the Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building, originally intended as the Social Security Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C., and its monumental New Deal mural paintings and relief sculptures, which tonight's webinar will briefly mention. As I have stated in co-written editorials and through a change.org petition demanding that the government do right by the American people, please sign our petition if you haven't already, the American people have not consented to accelerated sale of our national treasures without historic preservation requirements in place. We do not approve destruction or demolition of the Cohen Building, which LND's founder, Gray Brecken, calls the Sistine Chapel of New Deal art. Such advocacy work is particularly important as we honor the 90th anniversary of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project this year, and think about the future of government funding for the arts during ongoing and escalating threats to the New Deal legacy and public support for the humanities and arts in general. As leader, it's been my great pleasure to build such momentum among New Deal art studies enthusiasts, and in addition to public advocacy, to find new ways of sharing emerging research, such as the book that we'll be discussing tonight, and recent and forthcoming publications produced by ANDA members, such as the special issue of Source Notes in the History of Art, devoted to New Deal art, which was co-edited with one of our speakers, Erika Doss, who's also an ANDA board member, and new research into the forgotten legacies of New Deal art in the 1970s, featured in a special colloquium section of Panorama, Journal of the Historians of American Art, published last month, which is titled Why Federally Funded Art, and was co-edited with Jacqueline Francis, another ANDA board member. With ANDA, we are at the forefront of collaborative work that seeks to share just how important and relevant New Deal art and its legacies are to the 21st century. And now to introduce tonight's speakers who have been devoted to studying and teaching New Deal art and the issues that it raises for many years. John Murphy is the Philip and Lynn Straus Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College. And Erika Doss is the Edith O'Donnell Distinguished Chair of Art History at the University of Texas, Dallas. Together, they will share reflections on how New Deal art helps us confront the past and pressing issues today, such as freedom and censorship, race and representation, art and activism, politics and propaganda. And they'll be discussing John's new book, New Deal Art, a long-awaited and affordable, accessibly written, wonderful survey that I hope many will use in the classroom. John and Erika, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I am delighted to moderate this webinar on teaching New Deal art and discuss John's new book, New Deal Art, Culture and Crisis in the Great Depression. You can go back one slide if you want, John. Just published by Thames and Hudson, as Mary said, as part of their World of Art series. John's book is a very welcome addition to the field of New Deal art and New Deal art history, a field that I think has really been generally under-examined and yet embodies subjects and issues, as Mary just stated, that I find especially salient today: politics and propaganda, race and representation, freedom of expression and censorship, art and therapy, American art and cultural diversity, American art and public access, American art and cultural democracy, and as per the history of American art in general, issues of funding. Next slide. This year, 2025, marks the 90th anniversary of the Federal Art Project, the FAP, a New Deal art program that provided emergency labor relief for thousands of American artists during the Great Depression. The crisis of an American scene, evident in economic collapse, massive unemployment, widespread poverty, and environmental chaos, demanded relief, which Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs aimed to provide. Branded in red, white, and blue with the logo of an eagle and a palette, the FAP was the visual arts arm of the Work Progress Administration, the WPA, a federal agency that employed millions of Depression-era Americans on public infrastructure projects ranging from roads and parks and bridges to hospitals and schools. The results, next slide, are impressive. In less than a decade, American art was radically transformed by patronage under several New Deal alphabet agencies, including the WPA FAP, the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which sponsored documentary photography, TRAP, the Treasury Relief Art Project, and the Section, both of which were sub-agencies of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, which commissioned public art for federal buildings such as post offices and courthouses. Emphasizing public accessibility and cultural diversity, recognizing American artists as workers, and embracing American art as a key tool in the forging of a democratic public culture and art for the millions, New Deal art was wildly successful in terms of volume, audience response, and the futurity of American art. It was stylistically diverse, as these examples of murals painted for a post office in Grand Junction, Colorado, and a housing project in Brooklyn attest. In fact, the evolution of post-war strains of abstract American art would have been unthinkable, one artist remarked, without the encouragement to survive an experiment afforded in various federally funded New Deal art projects. And prominent post-war artists, including Lee Krasner, Louise Nevelson, Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, all worked on the projects in the 1930s. Next slide. John's book highlights the art and artists of New Deal America, from activist artists like Harry Gottlieb, who championed labor reform. The next slide. To self-taught artists such as Patrocino Barella, a Santero in Taos, New Mexico, who carved cedar wood and juniper bultos of religious figures. His book further examines the conflicts and contradictions inherent in the New Deal's approach to cultural democracy. In 1943, next slide, as U.S. unemployment increased due to wartime mobilization, most of the art projects came to an abrupt end. No plans were made for the preservation and maintenance of New Deal art. No inventory was established of what had been produced, where it was located. In 1944, Life magazine published this breezy two-page piece on WPA art being sold as junk. And you can see various murals and paintings in these photographs here, which have been largely described, and some of them even found. Although the GSA, the General Service Administration, which was established in 1949, is mandated by Congress with the stewardship of federal art, the overwhelming volume and breadth of the New Deal art projects, as well as limited federal resources, have hindered the development of a national archive or museum devoted to New Deal art. Over the decades, much of it has been lost or destroyed, next slide, or entered into private collections. Washington's Cohen Federal Building, which Mary was just talking about, which includes what Ben Shahn considered the best work he had ever done and is today a federal property listed for sale, is one of many examples. Issues of cultural heritage and historic preservation are key prompts in thinking about and teaching New Deal art today. I'd now like to turn to John for further insights on New Deal art and the potential of cultural democracy and why you wrote this book. Thanks.
Thanks, Erika. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you specifically. Your work has been such an inspiration for me and for this book in particular. And I'm very grateful to the Living New Deal for facilitating the webinar, but more broadly, just for all of the advocacy and educational work that Mary and the Living New Deal staff do. Um, Erika has done so much to make New Deal art better known, better understood, and also nuanced and more complicated. And as Erika knows, and many folks on this call may know, for a long time, New Deal art wasn't really taught or thought about at all. In 1967, the author of the Thames and Hudson World of Art series, Contribution American Art Since 1900, concluded that the WPA programs produced almost no art of any consequence that has survived, a somewhat damning verdict. So it is with some satisfaction in that about 60 years later, Thames and Hudson is finally allowing a rejoinder in the form of New Deal art, culture in crisis in the Great Depression. And it's meant to be really a general audience introduction and overview and summary of the various government-funded art programs during the New Deal. The idea is that it's for audiences that are curious, but the book doesn't assume any prior knowledge. And so the conversation between Eric and I will also really be about how books like this, and more broadly, how we can think about teaching resources for how to teach and how to study New Deal art. And I want to give a shout out to all the great scholarship that has been done in the decades since Barbara Rose's 1967 book. So there's a QR code here. There will be QR codes throughout this presentation linking to different resources. I think links will also be available in the chat and then in the video description later. But you can see just from the smattering of titles on screen that there's really been a flourishing of thinking, research, writing, scholarship on the New Deal art programs. And some of these authors have also been part of Living New Deal webinars. So go to the archive and check out some of those presentations and interviews and conversations as well. But I think to begin with, it's easy enough to refute the uh, argument that no art of great consequence was made on the New Deal programs. You just think about the artists that Erika mentioned who got their start on the programs, artists like Alice Neal, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Philip Guston, Louise Nevelson, Isama Noguchi, Mark Rothko. And one of the advantages of the World of Art series that Thames and Hudson publishes is that they include a lot of color illustrations. There's just a lot of images in the book. I think there's over 250. And so the advantage of that is I think folks may be coming to the topic who have preconceived ideas of what WPA art looks like or what art of the 1930s looks like. I hope we'll maybe be surprised by the variety and the vitality of art that was made in different styles, different subject matters, different media, from abstract murals to surrealist lithographs to proto earthwork playgrounds to modernist posters. So it's a sort of dizzying array of work that was actually produced as part of the New Deal art program. So just making that point right off, I think, is really valuable. But ultimately, I think the value of teaching New Deal art goes beyond reciting a litany of great artists who made masterpieces, who made significant work. I think that's certainly true, and I think that's something we can teach and remind students of. But I think what's fascinating about the New Deal programs and what drew me to the topic in the first place is really this idea that for 10 years in the 1930s, from about 1933 to 43, the New Deal art program subsidized by the US government really tried to imagine the relationship between art and society. It's really this idea of cultural democracy, the idea of art by the people, for the people, where art is really thought of as something more like clean water or electricity or education as a resource, something that has intrinsic value that can be shared as a public resource. Um, the director of the Federal Art Project said the goal of the FAP was to bridge the gap between the American artist and the American public. And so, to that end, New Deal art went well beyond the private gallery and the museum. You see that it occupied uh, alleyways, subways, the walls of high schools, libraries, and prisons, and hospitals, and post offices. And millions of Americans who'd never set foot in a museum or gallery gained access to original art and art education through government funding. And Charles White, the artist you see on the left, said, looking back at my 3 years on the project, the most wonderful thing for me was the feeling of cooperation with other artists, of mutual help instead of competitiveness, and of cooperation between the artists and the people. So in a lot of ways, the book is really an attempt to understand how you get from the painting on the left by Isaac Sawyer, sort of grim and despairing image of out of work folks in kind of the purgatorial limbo of the waiting room of an employment agency to the much more hopeful and optimistic scene on the right by Isaac's brother Moses of gainfully employed artists on the WPA from 1935. And one of the challenges of teaching New Deal art is reminding students of a time before there was Social Security, before there was Obamacare, there was really no social safety net to speak of. You worked until you dropped, you risked starvation if you were fired. And when Roosevelt took office in 1933, about a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. The banking system was on the verge of total collapse. And so Franklin Roosevelt won the 1932 election on a pledge of a New Deal for the American people, including work relief programs like the WPA that would mitigate the effects of the Depression. But I also remind students that it wasn't a foregone conclusion by any means that the government would support artists as part of those public works. But it was really thanks to the efforts of organized artists, the vocal advocacy of key supporters and lobbyists, that the Roosevelt administration ultimately did fund art as a way to simultaneously put artists to work, promote New Deal policies, and shore up the country's very shaken faith in its institutions. And Moses Sawyer remembered the WPA as giving, quote, artists a feeling of belonging, of being useful members of society. He called it a fine and hopeful period for American art. So between 1933 and 1943, the government subsidized art on a massive scale. It really opened up the floodgates of creativity nationwide through a series of programs that you see listed on screen. And the book proceeds roughly chronologically, covering these different programs, sort of chapter by chapter, from the Public Works of Art Project through the Federal Art Project. I'm also referring you all to an incredibly helpful interactive map that's been developed as one of the resources that the Living New Deal offers, where you can zoom in and zero in on your particular town or municipality and see what kinds of projects happened either through the WPA or specifically through the arts programs. I'm not going to try and summarize all of this, the thousands of murals, the tens of thousands of paintings, the hundreds of thousands of prints and photographs, the millions of posters that were printed as part of the government programs. I'm just going to try and hone in on a few key themes, a few key questions that I found helpful in teaching New Deal art, and that also offered some frameworks for my thinking in the book. Um, So one of those frameworks is the American scene and this question of how the American scene really relates to this idea of cultural democracy. So the first New Deal art program, the Public Works of Art Project, operated as a relief program from December 1933 to the spring of 1934. And the agency hired artists to make work for tax-funded buildings like schools and hospitals, government offices. But the question quickly arose, what would the artists make? What would painters paint? And so you see the quote on screen from the PWAP director, Edward Bruce, who said the subject matter assigned to PWAP artists was the American scene in all its phases. Within this scope, the artists were given the utmost freedom of expression. But as I say in the book, that was a little bit like Henry Ford saying a customer could have a car in any color so long as it was black. I mean, what was the American scene? What did it look like? What were the templates or the models? Uh, Bruce was himself a painter, and I think his painting industry that you see on screen offered a model, a scene recognizable to audiences and to viewers, done in a style that's not too avant-garde, but not too academic either. So this was a style that Bruce thought was appropriate for the idea of cultural democracy. And his assistant director, the PWAP official Edward Rowan, expected common sense to prevail. He said that any artist who painted a nude for the PWAP should have his head examined. Rowan was friends with Grant Wood of American Gothic fame, and the American scene bore resemblance to regionalism. Wood served as the state chairman of the PWAP in Iowa, and he was hoping that the government program would really help uh, sort of wean American artists off of the influence, what he saw as the pernicious influence of European modernism. And he wanted to root it back in kind of heartland virtues. And you see some of that exemplified in his mural for Iowa State University for the library there. But something I tried to emphasize with students is that the American scene was very much contested. It wasn't really obvious or a given what it was supposed to be or what it was supposed to look like. So the PWAP also sponsored a four-part mural cycle by the Harlem Renaissance artist Aaron Douglas, aspects of Negro life. This was for the Harlem Branch Library in New York. So featuring Douglas's signature silhouettes and concentric circles, the epic cycle traces Black American history from Africa through enslavement, emancipation, the Great Migration. And in the panel you see on screen, from slavery through Reconstruction, a towering orator at center points to a distant city on a hill, the unfulfilled promise of America's more perfect union. So for Douglas, the American scene includes the Ku Klux Klan, includes lynching, includes racial terror, includes self-emancipation, includes the vision of a more perfect union that has not yet been fully realized. The success of the PWAP opened the door to other government initiatives to support artists. So the Treasury section of painting and sculpture, later the section of fine arts, was established in October 1934 with Bruce at the helm to carry forward the PWAP's momentum. And the section sponsored competitions to hire artists to make art for federal buildings, mostly post offices. So this initiative was also a form of cultural democracy. Bruce hoped that post office murals would, quote, take the snobbery out of art, and make art part of the daily food of the average citizen. And there's some 1,100 of these post office murals in total. There might be one in your town or your city that you recognize that you're familiar with. It might look something like the image we see on screen, Louise Emerson Ronnebeck's The Fertile Land Remembers. And it's easy to take these kinds of images for granted and to think we know what it is that we're looking at. Here we see past and present blurring and these kind of cinematic dissolves, native bison hunters displaced by this pioneer family, their homesteading is giving way to a background world of oil derricks and transmission towers. But the scholar Michaela Elaine Reif has pointed out that a painting like this can raise more questions than it answers. In this case, is the pioneer family the past or the future? Is modern industry to be celebrated or lamented? What is it exactly that the fertile land, whose land, remembers? So this is something that I try and encourage students to think about, that some of these murals that may be overly familiar are actually trying to account for certain contradictions in American history that remain unresolved. And one of those questions is where Native Americans fit into this history. Nearly a quarter of section murals depict Native Americans, mostly by white artists, but with a few notable exceptions. So Woodrow Woody Crumbo was one of 6 indigenous artists who was commissioned to paint murals for the Department of the Interior building in Washington, D.C. And Crumbo said that he was attempting to record Indian customs and legends now to make them, while they are alive, to make them a part of the great American culture before they too become lost. So for Crumbo, Native American ritual, traditions, customs, histories, legends were all very much a part of the American scene and very much needed to be imaged, recorded, documented, and put on the walls of government buildings. And for anyone interested in this fascinating topic, one resource that was incredibly helpful for me was the Smithsonian's virtual exhibition, Indians at the Post Office. So there's a link to it here, which really offers a lot of helpful context and commentary on murals both about and by Native American artists. So these kinds of murals, they pose obvious questions, some that may be occurring to you as I'm speaking about cultural democracy. I mean, how should a country's history be portrayed and by whom? So Victor Arnautoff's Federal Art Project mural on the life of George Washington for a San Francisco high school sparked a national firestorm in 2019 when the city's Board of Education voted unanimously to paint the murals over. And Arnautoff had departed from textbook hagiographies in portraying Washington as a slave owner whose push for westward expansion made him complicit in native genocide. But Black and Indigenous students at the high school saw harmful imagery by a white artist that they felt made for a hostile learning environment. So these kinds of controversies and questions are really interesting to get into with students to see sort of these different perspectives that can be brought to bear. In this case, Arnautoff was a Russian-born leftist who was painting against the grain of received American history. So that sort of complicates and nuances, I think, what it is we're looking at. But at the same time, it's undeniable that New Deal art, especially public murals, often endorsed kind of white settler visions of history that glossed over or ignored realities of conquest, slavery, and native genocide. And I point you to an extremely helpful resource, which is from the Living New Deal, which is a, I think, recently published essay on the history of these controversies and some context for how to talk about them and ways of approaching them that can be helpful today, and I think be really useful prompts for discussions in the classroom. Another of those active questions that are really interesting to get into with students is this question of whether New Deal art was propaganda or not. And I think the Farm Security Administration photographs are a really useful way to get at that question, if only because Migrant Mother is arguably the most iconic image of the Great Depression and one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century, certainly. And so there's prior familiarity often with this photograph, but it's interesting to then get into a deeper context and try and see what else can we learn about the time period from thinking about this photograph? Who was this person? Who was this woman who was photographed? What was her story? What's left out when a figure becomes a kind of icon, a Depression era Madonna, the story of her lived reality as a Cherokee woman, as a union organizer? What's left out when an image becomes an icon, essentially. Um, a lot of students are surprised to learn more about the fact that Dorothea Lange was working for a government agency, was working for the Farm Security Administration, which was trying to work to redress rural poverty, and the struggles of farmers and workers with drought and with dust storms. So the Library of Congress has really helpful resources on the Farm Security Administration photographs. They're available to download as high res TIFFs, which is fantastic. So this is really an example of the Library of Congress kind of holding and stewarding this public resource in perpetuity for the future. But again, this question of propaganda is one that I think students are interested to try and understand. I quote Arthur Rothstein, who is a colleague of Dorothea Lange's, who said it was our job to document the problems of the Depression so that we could justify the New Deal legislation that was designed to alleviate them. So these photographs had very functional purposes. They were very much designed to try and encourage public support for legislation that would alleviate the suffering of the rural poor. Is that propaganda? And if so, how does it compare to propaganda in other countries? That's a topic for another webinar, but certainly a topic that can be very engaging with students. And this question of what is the relationship between art and democracy in a pluralistic country? I mean, that was really the main question driving the Federal Art Project, which, along with the Theater, Music, and Writers Projects, began operating in October 1935 as part of Federal One, the cultural arm of the Works Progress Administration. It was a federal agency. It was designed to put the unemployed to work, including artists. And between 1935 and 43, thousands of artists from coast to coast in big cities and small towns produced some 2,500 murals, 17,000 sculptures, and over 100,000 easel paintings. Hundreds of thousands of prints came off the presses through the Graphic Arts Division, which also made advances in screen printing and color lithography. And I just put on screen Chet Lamore's provocative color lithograph, Ku Kluxers from 1939, which I think shows what artists could get away with on these government projects. The fact that this is stamped in the corner with Federal Art Project, when it's a subject that is clearly so sort of daring, and you couldn't really imagine as a public mural. And it maybe was because you could get away with more making prints than making paintings or murals. So that's an interesting thing to think about or get into, is the question of media, and how it's different. A photograph is different than a print, or different than a mural. The Federal Art Project raises another question, which what kind of labor is making art? The FAP challenged the stereotype of the artist as a sort of dissolute bohemian, eccentric genius. It gave way to a new concept, the artist as worker, as Joe Jones proudly portrays himself on the left. And it's worth remembering that the 1930s is the decade of active labor militancy, the US government recognizing for the first time the rights of workers to organize unions. So labor itself becomes really one of the major themes of art of the decade, and Erika has written extensively and eloquently on this topic. The Anton Refriger study for a mural at center, you see a muralist at the bottom, a sculptor in the middle, but then a bricklayer at the top. And so Refriger is really making a claim about the continuity between the manual labor of the bricklayer and the work of being an artist. So what kind of work is making art, and how is it portrayed, and who's doing the work, and what kind of work, and how is work gendered, are all questions that I think are really interesting to consider with students. I just want to mention as well, a great resource is the Archives of American Art, the Oral History Project, which included nearly 400 transcribed interviews with New Deal artists and administrators. So a great resource, so valuable that it's online. Refuge is just one of these almost 400 artists who's are giving firsthand accounts of their experience. Extremely useful. I also want to mention the National Gallery of Art, which is the caretaker of about 18,000 watercolors that were made as part of the FAP's Index of American Design unit. This was a unit that was committed to doing really exquisite, beautiful watercolors of kind of functional, decorative crafts, everyday practical art objects from the colonial period up until about the year 1900. And I find this to be a really fascinating facet of the art project and what it does in terms of encouraging a way of thinking about art that has more to do with the art of the everyday, art made by anonymous artisans. What's the difference between art and craft? I like to encourage students to think about objects in their own lives or in their own homes and what stories they tell about priorities of a culture. And national character, and also what stories are included in the index and what stories are left out. Um, and arguably the major initiative of cultural democracy for the Federal Art Project were the community art centers. There were over 100 of them across the country. They offered visitors a chance to make and see and experience original art. Many of them became vibrant cultural hubs. Arguably, the most famous was the Harlem Community Arts Center, which in its first 6 months had over 70,000 people participating in programs and events like lectures, exhibitions, and free art classes. William H. Johnson took inspiration from his students. Jacob Lawrence was barely out of his teens when he was taking classes at the HCAC. And the director, Gwendolyn Bennett, said the HCAC was really a vision of a new and better world, a world of cultural democracy in action, art for the people where they lived and where they worked. But it was also a vision born of struggle. It was something I try and stress to students is that it was really established through the efforts of the Harlem Artists Guild, which was founded in 1935 as an advocacy group by artists that included Romare Bearden, whose cartoon you see on the left that shows a group of Black Americans on a promontory overlooking a march to on the road to recovery that includes the alphabet soup of New Deal agencies, the PWA, NRA, and AAA. So the implication, of course, being that African Americans are left out. It's a complicated story. A quarter of a million Black Americans worked for the WPA, and there was a historic transfer of electoral loyalty from the Republican Party of Lincoln to the Democratic Party. But they also Black Americans also faced discrimination on these programs. Last hired, first fired, as the saying went, and were often assigned the most menial or the lowest paid jobs. So, as Marianne Kalo has argued in her recent book, gains by Black artists were often hard fought, the product of organizing, boycotting, and lobbying. And the Artists Union was really sort of joining the Harlem Artists Guild in this effort. So again, trying to emphasize to students, cultural democracy is not given. It's something fought for. It's part of a struggle. So the union was formed in 1934 to advocate for better working conditions, increased pay, freedom from censorship on the federal art programs. The union argued that art is a natural resource of the country. They tried to make the federal art programs permanent, obviously did not succeed because there was not consensus on the value of the art programs. They were controversial from the beginning. They were constantly beset by challenges. Conservatives objected to the New Deal programs as wasteful boondoggling on shiftless or subversive artists. And by the end of the 1930s, an emboldened coalition of anti-New Dealers in Congress took aim at the art programs. And it was finally the shift to the war economy as the U.S. entered World War II when Roosevelt said the WPA had served with distinction and earned its honorable discharge. So it was the experience of Japanese American artists like Minei Akubo, who worked on the Federal Art Project and published an eyewitness account of her experience in a prisoner of war or a wartime internment camp on the West Coast, who reminds us that democracy was really not an abstract concept, but an ongoing struggle. But for all their flaws and contradictions, the New Deal art advanced a vision of art as essential to democracy in a pluralistic country. Women like Marion Greenwood, Dorothea Lange, Alice Neal, and Selma Burke made their mark as artists, teachers, and administrators. Indigenous artists asserted Native sovereignty on the walls of federal buildings. Jared French queered public art with same-sex desire in a post office mural like Mealtime with Early Miners. Latino artists Pedro Cervantes and Patrocinio Barella earned national recognition. And Roosevelt concluded that the conditions for democracy and for art are one and the same. He said that in a 1938 speech. So we all know, as Mary and Erika both alluded, that the arts are pretty malnourished these days, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Living New Deal for the work that they're doing to serve as an advocacy group and a watchdog group for federal art that's threatened by the ravages of time, neglect, budget cuts, censorship. So I would encourage anyone who hasn't already to please sign the petition to save the Cohen Building in Washington, D.C., with murals by Ben Shahn and Philip Guston, currently slated for accelerated disposal in the Orwellian phrase, because it's really by safeguarding the past in all its complexity that the Living New Deal helps preserve a model of cultural democracy for the future. At a moment when public arts funding is under attack, fine art remains the purview of the wealthy and the well-educated. The dream of cultural democracy remains a radical one. And that ultimately is why I think it's so important to teach and to study. Reminder that, if we want to think optimistically and hopefully, the New Deal's dream of cultural democracy might not be behind us, but ahead of us. So with that, thank you. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing and shift the conversation back to Erika, who has taught the New Deal, who knows it so well, who's so knowledgeable. And I would just be curious where you even start, Erika, with teaching the New Deal. As we just saw, there's so much material. There's all these different programs. There's all this work that was made, all different media. I mean, where do you start with teaching New Deal art?
Right. Well, I think, you've done this in your book, and the best way to start is to recognize that there was this understanding that both politics and economics, social, everything was collapsed. And people were terrified that the people would reject democratic forms of government for others and would reject capitalism for something else. So what to do? And then as you talk about in the book, and other people have written about, it becomes a work relief project. So, one way to think about this is set up the dire need, and the dire need was considered to be emergency labor relief. And they had no idea if it would be 2 months, 2 years, or how long it would actually take. And so these projects just sort of, snowballed, I think, in a lot of ways, as people were put to work and economic collapse was avoided, although we have another depression crisis in 1937. So, I mean, one way to begin talking about the New Deal is talk about the need for it.
Yeah.
And the need was dire, but it was predicated on work relief. So when work relief is remedied with war mobilization by 41, 42, 43, then it collapses. So what that suggests is, why wasn't it sustained as something else beyond just emergency labor relief? And that's the crux, that's the question. That's a really serious question for New Deal studies and for understanding New Deal art in general. What do you think?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, it's interesting that, and this is something I try and get across to students as well, is that they fought to make it permanent. The artists union, and there were real struggles and real efforts, and there were actually bills put forward, congressional bills put forward where they imagined this might continue more permanently beyond. Because I think the value was clear and people were seeing, but it was so contested. And again, this is the challenge of trying to create these art programs in a democratic society, in not a one party state where you can sort of just say top down, this is how it's going to be. They really thought there might be an opening for a kind of more permanent program. And that makes me wonder too, Eric. I was thinking about some of the things you've written about, like work, like labor. Um, what are some of the key themes or ideas that you try and get across? I mean, obviously, you can't cover every painting that was ever made on the WPA, every sculpture. So when you start to kind of hone it down and say, I'm going to focus on a few of these kinds of key ideas, what have you ended up kind of landing on as being topics or ways to start to organize that
Yeah,
material?
I think one way to rescue the New Deal is to talk about, as you've done so well, stylistic diversity, emphasis on cultural pluralism. And I do show the kind of propagandistic art in my classes that was being created at exactly the same time in Germany,
Mhm.
Italy, to a degree, the Soviet Union, just to point out some of the differences.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think we were quite sincere in stylistic diversity if you compare a Ronnebeck mural and a Stuart Davis mural. Um, and people were terrified as the 1940s turned into the Cold War that this New Deal art was all political propaganda for a kind of America that was rejected, the New Deal rejected in favor of, Cold War politics and Cold War consensus. And I'm struck by something that you mentioned about congressional lack of support and how mediated it was. It was considered to be just boondoggling, and
Mhm.
yet public support for the New Deal was tremendous, and it's
Mhm.
so similar to today. People do appreciate, want to be engaged in diverse American culture. And yet social media, or media to a degree, can just pummel it, and turn it into something that shouldn't be funded and shouldn't be touched. So I think that's one way to think about, dealing with the New Deal. But what I like about what we've done with the Living New Deal and some of the projects we've been engaged in is to not only talk about stylistic diversity, but to talk about diversity in general. It's not just post office murals and it's not just gigantic murals for federal buildings, but there were museum dioramas and there was incredible amount of textile work that was produced out of the Milwaukee Handicraft Project. And, so it's just widespread, forms of artwork.
Mhm.
And I find that quite fascinating. I think that's largely untouched too.
And I think it's something I'd be curious your thoughts, Erica. It feels like something that resonates with art today. I mean, so many contemporary artists are experimenting with textile and with fabric and with craft and with sort of community-based projects and community activated sort of initiatives. And you look back, and so many of that was happening
Sure.
in the 1930s already. Holger Cahill says one of the goals of the Federal Art Project is to break down this arbitrary distinction between fine art on one side and craft on the other, partially because he sees that fine art, paintings and sculptures, have really become kind of the purview of an elite commodity market. So what does
Right.
it look like to reintegrate art into everyday life? Um,
I think there's a busyness factor too,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
when you're depressed, probably not a great idea to just, keep scrolling. So there was a real attempt to get people to engage in crafts and engage in art projects. I mean, I like to talk about how during the 1930s, you've got, in addition to all the visual culture that we're talking about, the material culture we're talking about, there's music world.
Yeah.
There's so many music projects that were started in the 30s, and that's how people first took up instruments. And, talk to students. Well, did you guys take up an instrument in fifth grade? You know when that started? That started in the 1930s. So, there's a busyness, but it was a skill acquisition as well. There was a sense that, we can all be artists, we can all be creative, we can all participate in making things that, might make us feel better. Um, I think that the New Deal is great in terms of that. So,
And I think, as you say, one of the things that I think we try and do, and a lot of scholars are doing, thinking about the New Deal, is to bring attention to some of those other initiatives that have been have had less attention paid to them, partially because the public murals, and I'll be curious to get your thoughts on this, Erika, uh, at the time were controversial. They're still
sure.
controversial. So when the Arnatov firestorm lit off. It wasn't actually that unusual. These murals have been controversial since the 1930s. There have been waves of different kind of forms of protest and
Sure.
indignation. Some progressive, some reactionary. But I'm curious how you teach the controversy.
Right.
You teach
Well,
something like Arnatov.
Carol Ann Marling's Wall to Wall America, which came out in what, 1979, 1980, she
Yeah.
hones in on the Jenny McAfee
Yeah.
controversy with a mural in Texas, which included, a jug of alcohol at the hoedown, and everybody in that town where the mural was made, dry town, were sort of opposed, but they weren't that opposed. The mural's still there. It got some heated response in the press. She didn't get rid of the jug in the mural. So again, I think a lot of this is about media response, and the
Mm.
public's just sort of shrugging. So I think it's really important, if we're going to talk about controversy, to talk about what it is, how it started, how it ends, how people respond, rather than just take it as a simple story of, freedom of expression versus censorship.
Yeah.
It was often considerably more complicated than that. And often things weren't covered up, weren't painted over.
Mm.
Artists may not have gotten commissions in the end. There was a lot of that, but there's just I had a great experience some years ago driving through Nowata, Oklahoma,
Mm.
which is a small town. And, oh, look, there's a WPA post office, and going in and seeing a terrific Woody Crumbo mural, the Rainbow Bridge. And I just started thinking, oh my God, this is a trip. This is an incredible mural in the middle of oil and ranch land, all about, as you pointed out, Crumbo's pointed focus on recovering Potawatomi and other indigenous legends. And he's got this in this post office. And I just kept thinking, wow, tens of thousands of people have walked into this post office. I wonder what they make of it. And I think one thing that would be really interesting in New Deal studies is to actually start doing the public response,
Mm.
or trace it back to the 1930s. How did people respond to these murals, and find out in diaries or journals or letters to the postmaster or postmistress about how they felt? Then you can really get a sense maybe of this kind of cultural democracy as you're talking about, or cultural belonging. I know there's so many pathways to teaching this stuff because the stuff is so diverse.
And maybe I'll ask one more question, and then I know Mary's been keeping an eye on our
On
Q&A
our
and chat,
time. Okay.
and want to make sure to open it up to other questions. But are there, when you mentioned your experience of coming across the Crumbo mural, we do have the advantage of some of these murals still being in situ, still being extant. Do you take your students to some of these places? Do you encourage
Oh,
them
sure.
to seek them out? How do you bring some of that material
Yeah.
into your teaching?
Almost everywhere I've taught, I've tried to insert an assignment in which I force them to go out and find a New Deal post office mural, maybe during fall break or spring break, and to write up write a paper about it. It just depends where you live in, what part of the country. It's easy to do in Indiana because the state was full of them, but it's actually easy to do everywhere, as we saw from the New Deal map, because literally the country is blanketed. So I absolutely agree that firsthand experience with the material is important, and it really opens students' eyes to what was created. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm particularly lucky to be up in the Hudson Valley, sort of the land of FDR. So we have a lot of great murals up here in the FDR library. So I have no excuse not to take advantage of those opportunities for students. Um, I
Or
don't know.
just go to collections. I mean, the Racine, Wisconsin Art Museum has an incredible collection of thousands of New Deal textiles. The Wolfsonian in Florida has thousands of prints and paintings and deck arts I mean, they're sort of scattered all over, which is one of our problems in New Deal studies. There's no central archive, there's no mass collection, or inventory. But yeah, Mary, should we open it up to comments from audience or questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple in the chat. I wanted to ask you one straight off, which is what are your students' responses in the 21st century, specifically in the post-COVID world? What do they say about New Deal art?
John.
It's a great question.
Maybe start.
Great question. I actually find, and I will say, I'm not just, I mean, I am clearly biased on this, but I actually do find it interesting that, to your point, Erica, about the diversity of styles, the diversity of artists, students, I think were surprised to learn there were indigenous artists that were making art on the programs, showing things like Aaron Douglas's mural or Sergeant Johnson's work in San Francisco. And the social consciousness. I think students understand the pressure that artists felt in the 1930s, which is very similar to artists today. What obligation do you have as an artist in times of crisis, to make work that speaks to your moment? These were artists that really felt like they couldn't afford the luxury of making art for art's sake, of making these kinds of objects that didn't have a social concern.
Mhm.
Students seem to respond to that. They seem very interested in that question and interested in how artists from the 1930s responded to the rise of fascism, for example, responded to social injustice and economic inequity. Honestly, I have a harder time teaching abstract expressionism now, than I do the 1930s.
Huh.
Take that for what you will. Erica?
I've had students who are worried about political propaganda and
Yeah.
who worry that, well, if I work for the federal government, do I have to have some sort of federal government line? Do I have to buy into a particular narrative? And so one way out of that is to talk about, stylistic diversity and political difference and all the weirdness that is out there that doesn't follow any particular political line, which is the saving grace of the whole project. But that's the stumbling block I typically encounter, which is if you're working for the feds, it's got to be, a particular line, and I'm like, nope, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Uh,
We have another question. In teaching, do you tie the war art units of World War II, continuing a government art program, but with different aims?
John?
Yeah, I do. And in the book, I try and kind of show a little bit of what happens kind of as the WPA is being phased out of sort of work relief into national defense and the national industry. And how the government was in some ways trying to, I think at that time, wean artists off of the government. And there's a shift kind of towards private funding of artists making work related to the war effort. Thinking of Life
Mm,
magazine sponsoring artist works, or Abbott Pharmaceuticals, or things
right.
like that. I mean, somebody said the last image in the book is Edna Rindell, who'd been commissioned to do a series of images for Life magazine, who was at the Lockheed Martin factory in Los Angeles making planes. And there's a group of people who are working together on an airplane. And I compare it to Sawyer's Artists on WPA, and I say there's this interesting contrast, I think, where you go from all these this collective group of people working together on a mural cycle for a children's ward in a hospital to now this group of people who are working together on this fighter jet. And visually they're very interesting and very resonant. So it's there is a little bit of, I think, the way I frame it, or the way I interpret it in the book, that's where the resources go. Ultimately, that's where a lot of the effort is put into it. And I kind of allude post-war to the support for abstract expressionists to say, look, here's autonomous freedom of expression, and the social realism of the 1930s just falls completely out of fashion and is kind of swept under the rug, to the point where you have someone say in 1967 that there was nothing valuable made during the WPA at all. I think that's a very Cold War kind of
Yeah.
statement. I think that's
Yeah.
something that really comes out of that particular moment. So I hope that somewhat got at the question. That was a maybe long-winded way to approach it. But Erika?
I actually think that that's smart because sure, the New Deal projects continue for a brief period of time as war propaganda projects, and that feeds into the fodder against the New Deal in the Cold War era because they are propaganda pieces. I mean, that can't be denied in a lot of ways. So it's continuation in a way of the programs, but for a very different purpose, and ultimately something that hurts the discussion of, or the sort of historical and critical examination of New Deal art in the Cold War era. It's just, ugh, we don't want to talk about that. That just doesn't fit with our, individuality and our freedom of abstraction in the post-war periods.
And I'll just add to that very quickly that there's really interesting cases too of artists like Ben Shahn, he's trying to get designs produced through the Office of War Information, but they don't want his
That's right.
designs. They're not good propaganda. He's not good at
Right.
making propaganda. Yasuo Kuniyoshi, a Japanese American artist who's enlisted to make anti-Japanese art. I mean, it's the sort of
Right.
conflicted nature of how he's having to negotiate his identity at that moment, I think is really, really fascinating, and something definitely that can be discussed and worked through, I think, with
Yeah.
students in the classroom.
Yeah.
We've talked internally in the AND initiative, and I think in general in the New Deal art studies community, that there hasn't been a lot of scholarship on the 40s. That's kind of one area that seems to be an area of growth, and an exciting one. So Helen Harrison is asking, when I taught WPA art in the 80s, many of the artists were still living and
Mm.
students could interview them. How can we connect students with the lived experience of New Deal artists today? I just put in a quick plug for CETA, this other
Right.
group of federal artists from the 70s who are still alive to tell the tale. But how do you connect students with the voices of New Deal artists?
I think the interviews at the Archives of American Art are a real treasure. And those interviews with art administrators as well. Mildred Baker out of Chicago has opened all of our eyes about how so many things got allocated in 1943 and where New Deal art wound up, which is very new history that we need to write about. But yeah, most everybody's gone at this point. So, we go to the interviews that have been done, the oral histories that have been done and collected. And as we said, this is one of the problems of the field. There's no central repository. The stuff is scattered all over the country, which makes it, a bit of a fun treasure hunt, but also sort of frustrating in terms of, continuing the story.
I would just add to that, and maybe this connects to sort of this last question here, which maybe is a good place for us to to wrap up, which is also, artists like Kerry James Marshall is a living connection to this history. He studied with Charles White, at Otis in Los Angeles in the 1970s. And I think there's a very direct line from Charles White as a WPA artist in the 1930s and the public murals that he was making to a public mural project like Marshall's in Chicago and on the wall of the Chicago Cultural Center. Trying to find those through lines, and CETA, you mentioned Mary is also a really great example of like artists from the WPA who are then on CETA, who then sort of carry the torch in a way for
Or
these
the
ideas.
through lines in public art itself,
Totally.
which becomes its own industry and has its own sort of history from the 1970s, 80s to today. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. We have a kind of a final question, which is always, as I've heard one historian say, it's dangerous to ask historians to predict the future. But you know, how can the historical moment of the New Deal translate into a bold vision or a future vision for cultural pluralism and publicly funded art today? Do you have thoughts on a big national movement or initiative or moment to put artists to work in helping bridge social divides that we're experiencing today?
All yours.
I was so ready to
Tough
defer to you,
question.
Erica, on that. I mean, it's a great question, and honestly, it's one that I genuinely do like to enlist students in. I think they have a much better sense of sort of what's possible and how technology can be evolved and all these other things. Um, I am really curious to see what's possible in New York. We'll see what the policies are, with someone like Mamdani, who I think is kind of trying to carry the torch for a sort of New Deal type of way of thinking about art and culture. Are there models in some of these places that can be replicated elsewhere? I mean, it starts with well, I mean, what do you say? It starts with preserving what we have already. So thank you, Mary, for all the work you're doing and with the work the Living New Deal is doing. And I think one of the reasons that we need to preserve it, and that's why I ended kind of on that note, is the New Deal is a reminder that it's possible. It was possible to imagine a time when art would be thought of as not a luxury, but as something essential, as something that, was absolutely a nourishing part of a more abundant life. So, what could that look like? What could that look like in terms of things like the Green New Deal initiative, ideas that we have? What role could art play and some of these bigger, kind of bolder imaginings? Is it going to be something federal? Is it going to be something we'll need to work more actively on at the state and local level? Obviously, the levels of funding for art is discouraging. The level of public funding for public arts education is discouraging. So I do think we're going to have to get imaginative, and we're going to have to, work together to imagine some different possibilities going forward. We have examples in other countries. I mean, I was reading something about Mexico where artists can donate their art to offset their tax burden. And it's like, well, if rich people can do that here, why can't an artist
Huh,
do that?
interesting.
Do that in Mexico? So maybe it's things like that, or it's things like municipalities designating, ideas around zoning or designating specific
Well,
buildings or
yeah.
places. But ultimately, it's gonna be a larger question of, how can artists make a living in this country, and what role can sort of the public sector do to support that creativity if we can all agree that it's
I
needed.
think the local plays a huge role in this. And one good example is the widespread mural movement. Every city in America is the mural city. And it's sort of become, part of creative capital in a lot of cities. So, it's happening. It's happening on different levels. Artists are engaged in community, local, some to some degree regional.
Mhm.
But there's no large scale. And of course, what I'm talking about is offset by the presence of galleries and the presence of agents and the presence of art markets and fairs. So, I
Support your local artists.
yeah, Yeah.
And also, I would say, there are people who were involved in CETA who are now, or mentored by people who were involved in CETA, who are been
Right.
piloting basic income programs for artists in California and New
Mhm.
York and elsewhere, and sort of thinking about artists who are, fundamentally gig workers and how they actually, that particular economic system is going to be a kind of pilot for the future. And we really should pay attention to artists and think about how artists work because that may be the model for work moving forward. And artists are kind of at the forefront of democracy in that sense. So there are people who are successfully demonstrating how providing just a little bit of money for artists does so much for our society. So here's hoping um, bold leadership comes, to the fore and we could have a new deal
New Deal.
artist.
Right.
Um, Thank you so much, Erica and John, and
Thank you,
everybody
Mary
who
and John.
joined us tonight. Thank you to our donors who support this kind of programming. Thank you for everybody who cares about New Deal art and New Deal public works. If you have a chance to sign our petition, if you haven't already, please do so. Please write your representatives with concern. Please write editorials of your own in support of protecting federal architecture and art. We will see you soon. An upcoming webinar will focus on the Cohen building, so look out for
Great.
announcements about that.
Okay.
Good night, everybody. Take care. We'll
Bye,
see you soon.
everybody.